I'm Aparna Jacob, Professional Support and Development Officer at English Australia, and we are joined today by Melita Hoskins from the Ombudsman's Office. Melita is the Assistant Director of the Overseas Students Ombudsman, which began operating in April 2011. So they've been in operation for 4 years now. And Melita, we're so glad to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
As you know, the Ombudsman's Office investigates complaints and external appeals from overseas students about the actions and decisions of private ELICOS registered providers. In May this year, the Ombudsman's Office released an issues paper and fact sheet on monitoring course progress and attendance. And Melita, we'd like to thank you for your involvement in the EA webinar so far to clarify issues around attendance and progress monitoring.
Thanks, Aparna.
Thanks, Melita. So I can see some of you are here. We're still waiting on a couple of people to join us, but for the attendees who are now present, are you able to type in if you can hear, if audio is okay and you can see my screen? Okay, fantastic. Very good. Thank you for that. So we might get started now. Now, today's webinar will have two parts to it. In the first section, I'll be taking you through the English Australia Best Practice Guide on monitoring student progress and highlighting a few sections that you will find useful. I will then hand over to Melita to look in detail at best practice in monitoring course progress, especially in relation to policies and procedures that providers need to be aware of and follow. Melita will also provide an overview of the kind of complaints that the Ombudsman's Office receives. She will also be taking a look at case studies and how they were dealt with and issues that came from those case studies. We will also have time for questions at the end. So just to introduce you to the best practice guide, I'm sure a few of you have seen these and are familiar with these. Could I have a quick response to see how many of our attendees have seen or used the English Australia Best Practice Guide to Monitoring Student Progress? Could you please type in your responses? Yep, I can see some of you haven't seen this before. Briefly looked at it. Use as a guide to review your progress policy, have seen it. Fantastic. Now, for the attendees who haven't encountered the best practice guide, I will have a slide for you to show you how to find it on the English Australia website, which is quite large and extensive. And today's session is really to reacquaint you with the best practice guide and show you where to find certain kinds of information that you need when monitoring student progress. Now, the guide covers a lot. For a slim volume like that, it's how many pages? It's only about 17 pages, but it has a lot of information and covers a lot of ground. For example, it starts off by setting the different contexts for learning in ELICOS. It then moves into looking at Standard 10 and definitions that apply to ELICOS. Now, as you know, Standard 10 was designed for vet and higher education courses that have clear pass and fail indicators. Now, this makes it very challenging for ELICOS providers to demonstrate compliance. The guide actually looks at how these definitions apply to ELICOS. It also then looks at key features of best practice in monitoring progress. This information was collected based on survey responses from 30 member colleges. And this means it showcases a range of examples and ways in which progress is monitored across ELICOS. It also has suggestions and some very good ideas on monitoring, tracking, and reporting on progress. It talks about the importance of staff training, which means everyone involved in monitoring student progress in your organization needs to be on the same page, aware of your policies and procedures that apply to monitoring student progress and reporting. It also has a good section on different ways of supporting students who are not making progress. And lastly, it looks at identifying at-risk students. So this is some of the stuff the guide covers. Specifically today, I'll be looking at why monitoring progress in ELICOS is problematic specifically. I'll just wait for my slide to change. Okay. So why is progress monitoring in ELICOS problematic? As we know, language learning is a complex process. It depends on a range of factors, combinations like the student's goals, time available for study, student motivation to learn, their learning style, the course content and outcomes, the types of courses they enroll in, the methodology used in instruction, and the level of support provided by the school. Now, this also makes identifying progress and monitoring student progress quite problematic and complex in itself. One of the things we know is in ELICOS, a lot of our students, the majority of our students, come to Australia to gain that experience of being in Australia, making friends, building their confidence, building their cultural understanding, and being global citizens. These non-language gains cannot be discounted in our courses and when we talk about student goals and motivation. Weaving that into measuring overall proficiency, combined with their short enrollment periods that general English students usually tend to enroll for, given that pass and fail is not really suitable for our context, and it even may be inappropriate, all of these factors combined make it quite complex to monitor progress in ELICOS. So how then do we define what satisfactory progress in ELICOS is? Going through the guide, one thing I found useful was to narrow it down to two main considerations. Question 1, what do students want from their course of study? Question 2, how do we know they are getting there? This is one way I got my head around the concept of progress monitoring for ELICOS, and we're not talking about the courses that have clear competency-based outcomes or clear pass and fail outcomes. Now, colleges often can negotiate these goals with students as individuals or groups in terms of what they find acceptable as satisfactory progress. Colleges may have a range of options and may allot different weighting to different aspects of the courses, depending on what's important or relevant in that context. For example, some colleges may decide to include class participation as an important component when assessing progress, because it may be really linked to how many classes you attend, and your progress may be very clearly linked. Summative and formative assessments may be relevant in some contexts and may not be relevant in other contexts. So what I'm saying is not all courses will have clearly defined performance outcomes, especially in general English, because we use the CEFR. We often receive students with jagged profiles who develop different skills at different speeds, have certain cultural, because of their cultural background, may fall behind in certain skills as writing. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. But whatever is agreed on or negotiated on with these groups of students, it needs to be communicated to the students very clearly via the school policies and procedures. Students need to know if they're on track or not. They need to know where they can access help. The school needs to be providing the support, and this could be in terms of the DOS sitting down with the student and setting goals for the student. It could be a teacher doing this in the classroom. You might want to enroll your student services personnel in counseling. and deciding if the student has any other issues that need to be addressed that are affecting performance in the classroom. It also needs to be very clear what the consequences are if this agreed level of progress is not achieved in that agreed amount of time. So these need to be clear in your policies and procedures. One last point to do with progress in ELICOS. Often we think attendance is linked to progress, and yes, it is. Like I mentioned, attending classes may be linked to the amount of progress the student demonstrates, but they both need to be monitored separately, because you can't decide I'll report them on attendance only and not on progress. They need to be monitored separately and they need to be reported on separately. And this is something that Melita will be touching upon as well. Now, one of the things the guide highlights, and I found this quite useful, is to identify your at-risk students quite early if possible. The point of this is really that providers need to be proactive in helping students meet their goals. This is by no means to stereotype students, but here's a list that I found quite useful to identify your at-risk students, so that teachers, for example, can observe these students more carefully and offer extra support as needed. Now, research does show that some students can be identified as possibly being at risk, and that's why not making satisfactory progress. If you look at some of the examples here, there could be people who are living away from home for the first time in their lives, and this is really affecting their ability to focus in class and study. We spoke about students with a jagged profile, who might have some skills that are developed and some skills that are not to the level that we expect at that level, for example, at intermediate, and writing skills at intermediate. And I'm talking about Saudi students or students from the Middle East who often have writing issues with their writing. I've highlighted students with learning disabilities because, as we know, sometimes it's hard to identify these abilities in the classroom context. We did receive a question regarding students with disabilities and how a school can cater to them. This again goes into other areas such as the level of support the school is willing to provide or can provide. Because once identified, clearly this can't be ignored. It's then a question of bringing in counselors and talking to the student and discussing and coming up with a plan that is doable for both parties, really. At this stage, you might also think about involving the agents as far as the student's development goes and coming up with a plan that works. Students undertaking study in Australia because of poor outcomes in their home country, long enrollments, which can be demotivating for students and they lose interest. Unrealistic expectations and promises by agents could be a reason. Students with part-time jobs late at night and, they fall asleep in class, they fall behind in their studies. Now, going through the guide, I found some of the areas that are really useful for schools in terms of designing their progress policies, their intervention policies, and their reporting policies. If you refer to some of these sections, you will have enough materials to design your own policies. And if any questions, you can either contact me or the Ombudsman's office in terms of if this is compliant or what else you could do. So please look at the guide to find out more information on assessing progress and collecting evidence of progress in ELICOS. You will find this information on pages 8 and 9. How to track progress, both formally and informally. Record keeping is really important especially when it comes to reporting students. You do need your records in order. You need to have followed your procedures correctly. You will find more information on this on page 10. Reporting students on progress and how to provide information. You will find this on page 11. How to support students who are not making progress. Now, often with ELICOS providers, you're often running on limited resources and you probably don't have a separate department for student counseling. There are a range of ideas for different types of providers in the best practice guide, and you will find more ideas on page 13 in this regard. I'll now hand over to Melita, who will be taking us through specifically course best practice in course progress policies. So Melita, over to you.
Thanks, Aparna. Can everyone hear me? Just let Aparna know if I'm not clear. But I just wanted to say a special thank you to English Australia for hosting this webinar today and for giving us this opportunity of sharing this information. We've done a few webinars with English Australia and we really appreciate that collaboration, and we're happy to do other webinars on different topics, so I'll talk about that through the webinar if there are other things that you're interested in. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. I think there's just a slide today. Just to quickly introduce our office for those of you that may not have come into contact with us. So obviously not all of you participating today may not all be private providers, but the information is relevant for both public and private providers regardless. But it's just that we actually only take the complaints or appeals for the private providers. So if you're a public provider, your ombudsman would be the relevant state or territory ombudsman, so the New South Wales Ombudsman, Victorian Ombudsman, that kind of state-based ombudsman. And we do actually have a complaints handling teleconference with all the different ombudsmen to discuss international student complaints and try to make sure we're being consistent across the different jurisdictions that we cover. So just to quickly introduce the office that I work for and what we do. So obviously a big part is, I guess, our operational part of investigating individual complaints and external appeals from international students. Now we can take, most of our complaints are from current students, but we also can take complaints from students who may not have even got here or may have had a problem in the process of trying to become an overseas student, such as getting bad advice from an education agent. They can make a complaint to us, and also former overseas students who may want to make a complaint about something that happened while they were here on a student visa, but after they have left the country or changed to a different visa in Australia, but still want to make a complaint. So we can take complaints from all those different types of overseas students, and we investigate with reference to the Education Services for Overseas Students, the ESOS Act, and the National Code. And obviously today's webinar is looking at Standard 10 of the National Code regarding course progress. So our other two roles are to help education providers improve their own handling of international student complaints, and obviously today's webinar is part of that. We also have a lot of presentations, issues, papers, things like that on our website, and a best practice complaints handling guide. So there's some resources on our website which I'll put up at the end. And we're always happy to do webinars on other topics related to what we see through our complaints handling. And that's the third function, is really to feed back to the sector what are the trends or the systemic issues that we see coming up repeatedly or coming up across multiple providers, so that it's not just individual problems but repeat issues that we see, so that we can feed that back to the sector so that people can make improvements where necessary, and we can try to prevent seeing the same types of mistakes or the same types of complaints if we can avoid that. So I'll just move to the next slide. So as Aparna said, we've been operating for about just over 4 years now, and we've done some recent data analysis to see what were our top 4 complaints. And so we're going to be releasing a report soon which will discuss the main issues that we've been seeing. I'll just try and move that again so that you can see the chart that goes with that. So one thing that was interesting is the difference when we look at across all the sectors, but then compared to ELICOS. So ELICOS is a little bit different. Here we go. So these are our top 4 complaint issues for all the different education sectors. So we do cover schools, non-award, ELICOS, vocational education and training, vet sector, and higher education. So we cover all education sectors. The majority of the providers who are private CRICOS providers who fall into our jurisdiction are VET and ELICOS, and smaller numbers of higher ed and schools. So you can see here that the number 4 over all the education sectors is monitoring course progress. So, and monitoring attendance is number 3. So there've been, and these 4 issues, fees and refunds relating to written agreements, Standard 7 transfers, these 4 issues have been steady across the whole time that we've been operating. So they are the top 4 things that we get contacted from students to either make a complaint or to lodge an external appeal. So the outcomes, now this does not include ELICOS, because in researching for this webinar I discovered we actually have not had any course progress external appeals for students in an ELICOS course. So that's quite interesting. But for the other sectors, in terms of what our outcomes are, in the majority of cases we have found that providers have followed Standard 10 and their course progress policy correctly, and that they are required to report the student. But there's also a significant portion there where we found in support of the student because the provider had made some substantial errors in the way that they had either they had gone through that monitoring and reporting course progress process. So that's the point of having these sorts of webinars, to try and feedback what we're seeing. Now obviously, as Aparna's gone through, ELICOS is different in terms of how you do course progress, and I think this is a good kind of joint exercise between English Australia and Overseas Students Ombudsman, because some of what I'm talking about is, I guess, the standard from the code, but then really it's complementing English Australia's best practice guide on monitoring progress, which really then outlines how that applies to ELICOS specifically. So looking at what are the top 4 complaint issues for ELICOS, attendance external appeals has been the number 1 over those 4 years, followed by refunds and fee disputes. Provider transfers is still there, and then issues with education agents. So, but they've been the 4 issues. Excuse me. We have previously done a webinar on attendance with English Australia, and also one on refunds and fee disputes. So we're happy to repeat those if people are interested. And obviously we're all waiting for the new revised national code to be released to see just in general what might be changing across the national code in general. But we can continue to do webinars based on the current requirements if people are interested. Okay, so as Aparna mentioned, we did release an issues paper on course progress and attendance, and basically a lot of what I'm talking about today is reflected in that paper of what were the key mistakes that we saw providers make, have we seen over the last 4 years, and also a fact sheet for students to say to students, here's what you should be able to expect your provider to do, and here are some of the things that you should do to help yourself meet course progress and meet attendance, and make sure things like, you know, if your provider talks to you that you're having trouble, make sure you respond and that you engage with any strategies that they provide to you. So, so that is available on our website. So I'll now go into what we consider to be best practice and poor practice. And best practice pretty much is a reflection of what are the national code standards for Standard 10. And then poor practice are real problems that we have seen from the external appeals that we have examined over the last 4 years across those education sectors. And as I said, it doesn't include ELICOS, but hopefully the webinar today can generate some discussion about course progress and how it applies to ELICOS. And as Aparna has outlined, you have the English Australia Best Practice Guide that gives you the specifics as well. So the first thing for course progress is that providers have to have their own course progress policy, and it's up to each provider to define what is satisfactory course progress. Excuse me. So as Aparna was outlining, that could be different if you're a direct entry program or a pathway program, or whether it's general ELICOS that the student is enrolled in. But basically, it's the beginning of the process that could lead to a student being reported to immigration for reaching that visa condition that says they must maintain satisfactory course progress. So you need to define what is satisfactory and what is unsatisfactory. So at what point would you consider that you would have to report a student to immigration if they did not meet certain standards or learning goals, even if that's individualised? And then you also need to, the second dot point is know at what point would you identify a student being at risk, because that's the point at which you're required to implement an intervention strategy. And the intervention strategy has to be implemented before you can report a student. So satisfactory course progress, I think probably the key thing for ELICOS is that if you are talking about general English and you want to make it individual based on the student's learning goals, then you would need to reflect that in your policy, that satisfactory course progress may be defined on an individual basis according to what's discussed between the Director of Studies and the students, and that that's reflected in some sort of record. So that if that student was not able to meet that despite intervention, and you had to send them the notice of intent to report, they went through your appeal process and they came to us, that we could see that you had a policy that said that either you're judging their course progress on competency based, and that's outlined in your policy, or if it's an individual based basis, that's reflected in your policy, and that policy is made available to students and staff so that everybody knows from the start of the process what's going to happen, and the student knows what the parameters are for them to be successful and to avoid being reported. So the intervention strategy is really the key thing. Now, it doesn't have to be a single strategy. It may be a number of strategies that are implemented, and really it's designed to assist students. So a student is identified as being at risk, then an intervention strategy, or strategies in the plural, are put into place to help that student to improve and to avoid being reported, because obviously nobody wants to see a student having to be reported for poor course progress. So, so I'm just waiting for it to go to the next slide. So some examples of intervention strategies. There are some in the Best Practice Guide for English Australia on page 14. So that talks about you could give extra homework in an area of weakness. It could be a formal program of guided individual learning that's negotiated with the student. Or it could be renegotiating the student's goals to be slightly less demanding, or to look at transferring them to a lower level or a different type of class. So there's some examples from English Australia. Some of the things, and there's more reflected in that guide, so you can have a look at the guide. In our issues paper, we list some similar ones that we've seen providers use, and there's some in the case studies that I'll go through at the end. So best practice is to implement that intervention strategy or series of strategies as soon as the student is identified as being at risk, to help them start to improve and hopefully not continue on a downward trajectory. But you have to have a time frame, I guess, for implementing that intervention strategy, and if at the end of that time frame they haven't improved, then there is a requirement that the provider would send the notice of intent to report and tell the student that they have the right to appeal that decision through your internal complaints and appeals process. If they go through that process and they're not successful, then the internal appeal outcome letter would tell them why their appeal was not successful, and would tell them that they can lodge an external appeal with the relevant ombudsman. And then if they come to us, we will notify you by email to your principal executive officer, and we'll ask you to weight the outcome before you make any decision to report. And then we will go through basically your course progress policy, what sort of intervention strategy you've put into place, whether you have done that, and also go through each part of Standard 10 and make sure that all of that has been followed correctly, so that the student has been given procedural fairness in order to be reported to immigration. So that's some of the best practice points. We'll move on to poor practice. I'm just waiting for the slide to move. And sorry, my voice has gone a bit gravelly. I'll just see if it will move again. Okay. Oh, it's gone too far. Go back. So poor practice is, and these are real things that we have seen, and we've seen them more than once. So providers having a course progress policy that doesn't actually define what is satisfactory and unsatisfactory course progress. So those definitions are up to the provider. So in the vet sector, they often use if you don't pass 50% of your subjects in one term or semester, then you're at risk. The intervention strategy is implemented in the next study period, and then if you have failed more than 50% of subjects or not yet competent 2 semesters in a row, then that's unsatisfactory, and that's the point at which you will be sent the notice of intention to report. But we do see some providers who just don't define that. So you cannot tell from the policy, and the student cannot know in advance what standard they have to meet, at what point they would be judged as having failed to meet that, what period they have to improve with an intervention strategy, and when they would be getting reported to immigration. So as a part has outlined, obviously with ELICOS, particularly if it's general English, it can be a bit trickier to define that, but you need to have some sort of definition so that we can see the student has been treated fairly and the decisions have been made according to a policy that's in place about when you would, what's satisfactory, even if that is satisfactory based on the individual learning goals that have been negotiated. And at what point would you be going to report the student? Now, this probably gets tricky with ELICOS as well, because ELICOS doesn't really always have study periods in the same way that VET does. So I guess it depends whether you're doing things in 5-week blocks or 10-week blocks, or how you want to set that out. There's some examples in the English Australia Best Practice Guide, but basically you need to think, even if it's a hypothetical scenario, if we had a student that didn't do the things that we wanted them to do, at what point would we be reporting them to immigration, and then to work backwards from that and to build that into a course progress policy. Obviously a course progress policy will involve more than that, but at the end point you need to know when you would be reporting a student. And we have seen providers, particularly in the vet, where they just haven't defined the point at which the student would move from a status of being at risk and under intervention to having, failed and needing to be reported. And what we don't want to see is students failing and being allowed to fail, over 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years, which we've seen in the vet sector. We've also seen some providers just fail to implement an intervention strategy at all. So obviously a student can't be reported without some sort of intervention strategy being implemented and attempts being made to help them improve. And the student needs to know what the time frame is for them to make that improvement before they'll be judged as having failed to meet satisfactory course progress. It needs to be meaningful, but there is a lot of variation in what providers do. Some providers do a lot, and other providers would do probably the minimum of asking the student to come and speak to the course convener or the director of studies for discussions about their course progress. And there's a range of strategies that could be used, and these are covered in the best practice guide, and we list some of them in our issues paper. But the timing is important. So we've seen some providers implement an intervention strategy, weeks before the course or the study period is to end, and obviously that's when their policy says that they have a longer time frame. So we're always looking to see what does the policy say and has the provider followed that in practice. We also had one case which was quite concerning where this was a university where a lecturer just cancelled the intervention strategy midway because the student didn't get an email that was sent that morning and didn't come at a different time. And obviously that wasn't reasonable to just cancel the intervention strategy on the spot for being late to one meeting when not enough notice had been given of rescheduling that meeting. And there was also nothing in the provider's policy to say that a lecturer could just cancel an intervention strategy for those reasons. So as I've said, where the policy doesn't define satisfactory or unsatisfactory course progress, I'll move on to the next slide. If it will move. This is taking a while. Okay. So we've also seen providers where they do have a definition of what is failing to make course progress, and they've got a time frame for implementing that intervention strategy. That time frame passes. The student may or may not participate in the intervention strategy. They are then deemed to have failed, but the provider doesn't do anything. So that would be a breach of Standard 10 in terms of there is a requirement for providers to report to immigration where the student has failed, according to that definition in the course progress policy, so that immigration can consider whether or not they're a genuine student. I might just note that we don't make judgments about whether a student is genuine or not. We're really looking at whether providers have followed the right process in terms of their policies and the requirements of the code to see whether the student has been given that procedural fairness before being reported. Other mistakes include things like sending the notice of intent to the wrong address. So obviously the student has then missed out on their appeal rights because they don't know that they have the 20 working days to lodge an appeal. So that goes back to keeping records up to date. Obviously, you're only required to update the student's address when they notify you of a change. If they fail to notify you of the change, then it's not your fault if they don't receive the notice of intent to report if it is sent to the last notified email address or street address or postal address. We do see some providers who just report students straight away without giving them appeal rights. So the student should be given 20 working days to lodge an internal appeal through your own internal complaints and appeals process. And we've also seen providers issue the notice of intent to report about course progress, but then proceed to report for a different reason, like student misbehaviour. So obviously, you can't report a student on a ground that you haven't first given them a chance to object to through an appeal and have their say on it. So there's some of the things that we've seen go wrong, I guess. And as I said, that hasn't related to ELICOS providers, but hopefully some of those reflections are helpful to you in understanding how we look at what providers have done if we receive an external appeal about course progress. So if we get to the point, as we have in 58% of cases, where we've decided that the provider has done the right thing and has followed their course progress policy correctly, implemented it as it's written, and they've complied with Standard 10 of the National Code, then we would go back and say it is open to you to report the student now. Now, you can actually report a student more than once on the same COE, so this often comes up as a question. So let's say, for example, sometimes things are going on at the same time. Let's say the student also hasn't paid fees and they've been sent a notice of intention to cancel their COE for non-payment of fees. Let's say that's just happened the week before we've made our decision on the course progress. So if the provider's already cancelled the COE for non-payment of fees, even though it's a cancelled COE, it does actually let you go in and report on a different ground. So, and education has confirmed that that is possible. So you can report for multiple reasons on the same COE. Sometimes we do have students who have both a course progress and separately an attendance external appeal with us because they've failed both standards. Generally, we see more attendance cases than course progress. Sometimes that's because if the student stops attending, they're more likely to fail that 80% requirement sooner than they'll fail course progress, which might be monitored over a longer period of time. But if they fail on both at the same time, then they would have the right to have two separate appeals on those two different grounds. So I think that covers that, which was a question that we received before the webinar. So what I'm going to do now is go through some case studies, which are actually from the English Australia Best Practice Guide, just to set out how course progress has worked in an ELICOS setting, because as I said, I don't actually have any case examples for ELICOS from our work because we haven't had any course progress cases directly from ELICOS students, although we've had a lot of attendance cases for ELICOS. So in this case study a small ELICOS provider with courses of 5 or 10 weeks duration. At the start of the course, students are given a teacher's expectation document, which outlines the expectations for making satisfactory progress in the course. And then there's also a first lesson on successful study, which basically draws on that and gives examples of that for students. Teachers monitor and report on problems early, so students can be counselled by the Director of Studies. Student progress is discussed during level meetings, and strategies are suggested for students who are not making satisfactory course progress or who are at risk of failing to meet that satisfactory level. The teachers conduct in-class interviews every 4 weeks with the students to discuss their progress. And if the student is not making satisfactory course progress, then the teacher recommends certain actions to help them improve, and this is recorded in the student's record. Record keeping is obviously very important, particularly if the student does progress to being potentially reported and going through the appeal process. Then we will come and ask for the records, and it's important that there are records to substantiate the actions that you've taken, the intervention strategies, any discussions about their course progress, that even if something is verbal, face-to-face or over the phone, that a written record is made to reflect that so that you can prove what you've done. So for this college, the teacher also completes a short form outlining the required action for the student's reference. And that's a good practice that we've seen to make sure the student has a written record to refer to of what they've agreed to do in terms of that intervention strategy. And I'm just waiting for it to move on. So case study C is a large ELICOS provider, so different to the first one. And it's offering a direct entry program and some Cambridge assessment exams and some general English, so a mixture of different courses. The college conducts regular assessment tasks based on the course requirements. A critical time period is identified for each course where students must have achieved certain levels of competency. So obviously competency-based is a bit more clear. And assessment procedures and tasks are discussed with staff in the university's TESOL faculty. So student progress is tracked on a database. Students are given extra support if required, even though that can be challenging, I guess, with the need to keep moving on to the next topic for other students. But individual students are assigned a case manager if they need additional assistance to monitor their progress in response to the intervention. And if they're having considerable trouble achieving satisfactory progress, or they're seen to not be applying themselves sufficiently, then we're missing a word there. They meet with the education, what are they called? Educational manager to draw up a one-page learning contract. The learning contracts is something that we've seen, so it's either a learning contract or it can be called an intervention strategy or learning agreement, setting out what's being discussed, what the student has to do, and that makes it clear that if they don't do those things or don't achieve the goals set out in that learning contract, then that can be a measure of not having achieved the satisfactory course progress. So in the first section of that learning contract, they set out the student's goals and objectives and the actions that the student needs to take. And that could be a range of things such as coming to class, focusing during class. Other things that we see is you might require them to attend a certain amount of classes separate to your normal attendance requirements. You might give them additional homework. You might set particular deadlines for them to hand in work. So once that has been outlined, and that can cover academic study as well, then those actions, once they've been negotiated between the student and the teacher, are agreed on, discussed, agreed on, written in the learning contract, and then they become non-negotiable. So that basically is the contract between the college and the student. Those actions need to be taken to improve their course progress, and if not, then that is going to be the point at which the student will be deemed to have failed to make satisfactory course progress. Sorry, just waiting for it to go to the next slide. So the learning contract is signed by the student and the manager. That signature is really good and quite important, because we could get a situation where the student says, well, I never went to that meeting. I never signed that contract. I never agreed to do those things. So having that learning contract signed by the student is important to evidence that they have agreed to that. Similarly, with other forms, we've seen sometimes the college has, excellent template forms to be completed, and then the teacher or whoever is speaking to them doesn't complete it properly or doesn't sign it themselves, doesn't date it, doesn't actually say what was agreed. So obviously, even if you've got excellent templates, they need to be completed with sufficient information to record what was discussed, what was agreed, and it's good to get the student to acknowledge that by signing, and to give them a copy for their own reference as well. So in this college, the class teacher is informed of the learning contract content, what's been agreed, and the educational manager or the student support officer keep in touch with the teacher regarding student compliance with it. And for this college, they noted that these contracts have proved very helpful for ensuring that students focus on their studies, but only where there are clear goals and the contract is not used as a punishment. So there's some examples, which I assume are real examples from the English Australia Best Practice Guide, and hopefully that that sort of exemplifies what we've been talking about in terms of the Standard 10 requirements, how that can apply in two different scenarios of ELICOS colleges. All right, so that's the end of what I wanted to present, but we've got at least another 10 minutes, so very happy to try and answer any questions that you have. If they're particularly curly, then I might take them on notice and seek some advice from the Department of Education. So the Department of Education obviously is the policy department. They create the national code. So occasionally we do seek advice from them about how that should be interpreted. But hopefully I can answer as many of your questions as possible.
Thank you very much, Melita. I do have a couple of questions come in. One of the questions is to do with record keeping and how long these need to be maintained for.
Now, I think I looked into this another time, maybe with attendance, and there didn't really appear to be anything specific in the code or the ESOS Act about record for these purposes. So there's specific requirements Actually, I have to double check. I think Section 21 of the ESOS Act, there are some requirements. I think it only pertains to assessment outcomes that have to be, yes, records of assessment. So records of assessment have to be retained for 2 years
And
after the person ceases to be an accepted student, so 2 years after they finish with you. If that's for records of assessment,
Yep.
But it's not more specific than that.
Okay. And it doesn't matter if it's in written or if it has to be a hard copy or it can be saved as digital copies.
Yeah, it doesn't specify, so I think either would be acceptable.
Fantastic.
I mean, unless ASQA as the regulator has additional, but I don't think there's anything in the ELICOS standards that I'm aware of. So, yeah, there doesn't appear to be any rules in the ESOS Act, at least, about that.
One of the questions we've just had come in is there a specific function in PRISMs to report on lack of progress, or is it reported via the attendance function? So when we go into PRISMs...
No, there's a specific course progress one as separate to the attendance one.
And Melita, also related to this, do schools need to maintain separate policies on reporting on attendance and reporting on progress and make the students aware of this?
As opposed to putting them together into one policy?
Yep.
Look, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, we just really want to see that you have a policy, whether or not it's together with attendance. If it flows together, I don't think that really matters. I mean, sometimes the policies we're given are sort of in the student handbook and they all flow one after the other. But the main thing for us is we just want to see that you have a policy that sets out those things in the code, whether or not that is combined with your attendance policy.
And as long as students are aware that they will be reported on progress and attendance, then as long as all parties involved are clear on that.
Yes. So one of the questions you emailed in before, Aparna, was about a university that said their policy didn't actually say here is how we will report you for lack of progress, like they did for attendance monitoring.
Yep.
So sometimes with universities we see that the policy is covering domestic students and international students.
Yep.
And so it tries to talk about the information that relates to both. But the fact is international students are different, and you do need to say for international students, you know, if you're deemed to have not met satisfactory course progress after the intervention strategy, then we would be sending you the notice of intent to report you to immigration, you know, subject to your right to appeal. So it's fine if you want to have a combined policy, but you do need to point out at some point what is different for international students so that you don't just talk about exclusion without saying, and exclusion also is the point at which we'll send you the notice of intent to report, which could result in you being reported to immigration, subject to, you know, but you'll have 20 working days to lodge the internal appeal, and then a further time frame that's up to the provider to set for them to lodge an external appeal if they're unsuccessful at the first appeal level.
Thanks for clarifying that, Melita. And also, I'd like to thank you for presenting at this webinar and for clarifying some of the issues that are specific to ELICOS and just helping us, as always, understand and interpret the code better. Are there any last-minute questions for Melita before we wrap up?
I might also say, unfortunately, we're not in a position to, I guess, give advice on providers' course progress or attendance policies outside of an external appeal. So if you did have questions about whether your policy was compliant, we can't really, we've got 950 providers that we cover, and we're not really in a position to give advice separate to considering it through an external appeal, so just to keep that in mind. But I guess, as you said at the start, Aparna, English Australia could potentially give some advice.
Yep. Sorry, Melita, could you just repeat that?
Oh, sorry.
I've been distracted by a question that just came in.
You're doing two things. Yeah, that's fine. Just that at the start, you said if people had questions about whether their course progress met the best practice, your best practice guide, or whether it met standard 10 of the code, that they could approach either of us. But I was just saying that unfortunately we're not in a position to be able to give advice outside of handling a specific external appeal. So if we've got an external appeal, we may comment on the policy, but we don't have the role or the resources to do that just outside of an appeal.
So we're very happy to entertain these questions, receive these questions, and then find out the answers to it, because we do have access to regulators, so we can talk to them and find out the answers for people. Now, one of the questions that has come through, Melita, is something we discussed before the webinar, which is to do with what's considered a reasonable time for intervention. I've just put this question out to the audience, but I know you've told me that the period, the course duration, and having enough time after the intervention policy and before the student finishes the course is the period that the student is allowed to show progress. Is that correct?
Look, it's harder for ELICOS. The wording in Standard 10 talks about study periods. So it basically says where the student has failed the first study period, you must put an intervention strategy in place, and generally you would give them another study period to judge whether they've improved.
Yep.
So that could be a bit more difficult, I imagine, for ELICOS, depending how you're defining the period of study, whether it's broken up into blocks or not.
Yep.
So I guess if not, you need to work that out for your specific courses. What would be the time frame that you would judge a student to be at risk? What do you think is reasonable in terms of them making an improvement? What's reasonable to ask of somebody in that course to make a sufficient improvement to avoid being reported?
Yep. I did find some information on page 6 of our best practice guide. It talks about the length of general English courses, and sometimes there is no clear beginning and end point, because sometimes they can be quite long. However, course can then be defined as the length of time the student is enrolled at the college, and the definition for unit for ELICOS is a block of 5 weeks, with many courses usually being 10 or 12 weeks. We're talking about 2 units, and within those units, students are expected to demonstrate some kind of progress. But this again needs to be specified by the provider, as you mentioned.
And there's also, thank you, yeah, page 9 too has some examples under collecting evidence of progress. It says regular, and then brackets weekly or 5 weekly tests of general proficiency.
Yep.
So I think it would be, yeah, as you said, the provider can choose those perhaps 5-week blocks or whatever is going to suit your course, really.
Yep.
And so it really is up to providers. The National Code gives providers that flexibility, I guess, to define what is relevant for their students and their courses.
Yep.
And some providers we see, they may have, they'll have a different policy for their vet students or their ELICOS students. And sometimes within that policy, they may even have different requirements for different disciplines or different courses. So you might have different requirements if you've got for your competency-based ELICOS compared to your general English.
Yep.
ELICOS. Yeah.
Thanks, Melita. So I hope that answers some of the questions that you had, Sandra, because you typed in this question. Unfortunately, I haven't received too many responses to this specific question when I put it out to the audience, but I hope that clarified some of the issues. Thanks, Sandra. We are running out of time now, and I'd quickly like to thank Melita again for being so fantastic and shedding more light on this issue and some of the tricky aspects of Standard 10. Now, one of the things I wanted to show everybody, especially those who haven't been able to access the best practice guide, if you go onto our website, if you can still see my screen, please log in to the services and resources section, and under teaching and learning are the best practice guides. You do need to log in to access these because these are members only resources. Non-members can buy these guides for $180. If you've forgotten your login, please email us and I'll be happy to sort that out for you. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope this has been useful. It's been tremendous learning for me. Melita, thank you again. And I'll talk to you
Thank you,
soon.
Hannah. Thanks for everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.